Good morning, everyone, and welcome to BDO's update on federal government incentive programs. This is a national webinar, so we are focusing on the federal programs rather than state government programs. And really what we're looking at is updates on the R&D tax incentive, the patent box regime, which was announced in the federal budget, and some quite substantive changes to the Export Market Development Grant Program. Joining us presenting today, myself, I'm the National Lead Partner for R&D and Government Incentives at BDO, based in Brisbane. We also have Travis Maddox. Yes, you can tell he's based in Melbourne, currently in lockdown. He's sent the kids out for the day, so he's right to present to us this morning. And then Joel Brown, who's a Senior Manager in our Sydney office. Travis is going to give an update on some of the federal government changes to the R&D tax incentive. Then and also the patent box regime. Then he'll flick over to me. I'm going to talk about the new online R&D application form. And then Joel is going to talk around the changes to the Export Market Development Program. This is really just an update. It's not an in-depth session on any of the programs, but there has been a little bit of change in this space, mostly positive, that we just wanted to bring to light and make sure that people were aware of. So I might hand over to Trav to start the session.
Perfect, thanks Nikki, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'm going to go through the legislative changes that were announced back in the October budget. We've already had another budget since then. It doesn't feel like that long ago, but these changes were announced and then legislated shortly thereafter. So essentially they apply for income years commencing 1 July, so only a few weeks away. They won't apply if you're a December year end until 1 January, for example. So they're only really as you commence your income year, they'll start applying from 1 July onwards. So the biggest change, I suppose, is there is no change for smaller businesses in some senses. So if you've got a turnover, aggregated turnover of less than 20 million, you may be familiar with that at the moment. The turnover ratios are staying the same. You'll actually retain the current refundable offset rate of 43.5 cents. So the corporate tax rate, by the time we start out 1 July, will actually shift down to 25%. So that's from the 26% that you might experience in the 2021 financial year, and the 27.5% you would have received for the 2020 financial year. But as that has gone down, what we're going to have now is there's going to be 18.5 cents as a net permanent saving over and above that corporate tax rate. So that's actually a slight increase in the benefit for those that are profitable. Those in losses will continue to receive the same 43.5% offset moving forward. So overall, that's pretty good news. There's no caps anymore that were previously advised to come through, and really you can continue on claiming as you currently are if you're under 20 million turnover. Where it gets a little bit more interesting is where you're over 20 million turnover. So all of a sudden now we're shifting into a different way of looking at your R&D benefit. And a great news is that broadly, you're likely to receive a similar benefit at the minimum, some slightly less, but most will receive a similar benefit. And if you actually have a higher R&D intensity as a business, you'll actually receive more. So this is where there's actually some really good news. It is a little bit complicated. Unfortunately, this is going to add to the complication in doing your calculations and actually budgeting for it, because we need to look at what's your total P&L expend and potentially even some balance sheet spend for the entire year, and then working out what proportion of that spend is R&D related. And that's something that's going to be a little bit hard to budget for in advance. You often don't know how much you're going to spend for the entire P&L, entire business, and let alone your R&D spend. But I suppose after year end, you'll be able to work out what proportion of your total expenses as a business was related to R&D. And then based on that intensity, so that R&D percentage divided by your total company spend, based on that intensity, you'll get a premium over and above the corporate tax rate. So if you're spending between 0 and 2% of your total expenses as a business, as a company, you will receive an 8.5% premium. That's exactly the same as what businesses over 50 million turnover currently receive. So that's that. You'll be quite familiar with that. You'll still get basically a 8.5% premium on top of the corporate tax rate. But if you actually spend more than 2% of your business spend on R&D, that portion over 2%, so the first 0 to 2% for everyone always gets the 8.5% premium. The portion above the 2% will actually be entitled to a 16.5% premium. So that's great for businesses that are spending more than 2% of their total spend on R&D. They'll actually probably start receiving a higher benefit than what they're currently receiving. And if you're spending a larger portion, the more you spend, the higher the proportion is. And I've got an example on the next slide. So just using this as a basic example, we've got company ABC company who has some R&D expenditure of $1 million. And just to keep it simple, we've got some total expenditure of $10 million. Now, maybe because of their grouping rules and the aggregated turnover rules, you've got an aggregated turnover of $100 million. In that case, you'll have a 30% tax rate. That's not going to change in the near future. And as you might see, based on your R&D spend divided by your total company spend, your intensity rate is 10%. So as I mentioned before, the first 0 to 2% always attracts that 8.5% premium. So that's exactly the same as what this business would be receiving currently. So they'll get 8.5% on their first 200,000 of R&D spend. But the great thing is the remaining 800,000 of spend, so everything above 2% of the total business spend, will attract the 16.5% total net saving. So overall, this business, if you work it out, actually gets a 14.9% total net tax saving. And of course, similar to current rules, you'll be able to carry that forward if you're in a loss position. So that'll be a carry forward offset, and where simple loss rules will continue to be applied. The other minor tweak that's happened here is that if you happen to be one of those lucky businesses that are spending more than 100 million on R&D, you can actually claim now up to 150 million of your R&D spend in R&D. Previously, there was a cap at 100 million. So there aren't too many businesses that applies to, but if you happen to be one of those businesses, you now can claim an additional 50 million in your R&D claim. So there are maybe 20 to 30 companies in Australia that might be applicable to. Some other changes that have just been announced as well. So as I mentioned, we've got that increase in the threshold from the 100 million to 150 million. Not too many of our clients are impacted there. But there are some other changes around what we call the feedstock rules. So that's where you have materials that you're essentially selling or scrapping. There are some changes there. In addition to that, there are some changes to the government grants. But in effect, the changes, although it'll be a little bit clunky for the first year, moving forward, they'll actually be a lot simpler in that if you're selling things for a profit, you'll basically just net off the difference. Same with government grants. There's no differences in the rates anymore, where it got a bit confusing where the company tax rate reduced, but they left behind some of the old rules around what needed to be added back for feedstock or government grants. And there was a bit of a funny difference in the current rules. Moving forward, it's going to be a little bit more cleaner. Just some extra calculations we'll need to do probably in the first year that might be a little bit confusing. The other interesting thing is that Innovation and Science Australia, or Innovation Industry and Science Australia, I think as it's currently known, has the ability to make binding determinations about its application. And there may be a possibility there that they'll actually publicly release a cutback version as well of some of those determinations, similar to, I suppose, applying for a private ruling with the ATO, where the ATO would then release edited private advice later. The other one that some businesses don't mind, others find a little bit interesting, is that the ATO is going to publish information about all claimants of the incentive and their R&D expenditure moving forward. So that'll simply be the company name, their ABN, and their expenditure. This will likely be around about 2 years, I understand, after the claims have actually been put in. So hopefully that shouldn't impact too many claimants in terms of privacy, but I suppose moving forward, that's going to allow greater transparency to understand what everyone is claiming. That's really the main changes. Everything else is staying the same when it comes to R&D, which is great. So we can continue to not be concerned about the other changes to the R&D activity definition or anything like that. So we can continue to claim as we have since 2011. But one other exciting regime that's been announced just in the most recent budget back in May was the patent box regime. Now, at the moment, its application is somewhat narrow, only to life sciences businesses. I'll put that way. But still, I think there's opportunities here for this to be expanded in the future. So I'll just briefly go through what this patent box regime is all about. Broadly, the government expects to spend about $206 million on this scheme over, I don't think that's a yearly basis, I think that's actually over 4 years potentially. And its aim is to encourage businesses to undertake their R&D in Australia, keep patents here, and commercialise from here. So from 1 July 2022, income that you actually receive from Australian medical and biotechnology patents can actually be taxed at a concessional rate. So you actually get a 17% corporate tax rate for income or profits that are derived from medical biotech patents, rather than the 30% or 25% tax rate. Now that sounds great, but obviously how you actually apply that in reality might be a little bit challenging. So that's only going to be, number one, on granted patents, so it can't be on patents pending, and it's only going to be on those that were actually granted or actually applying for post the May budget. So any pre-existing patents, unfortunately, we won't be able to include those in this patent box regime, and those profits on those existing products that you may have will continue to be taxed at the normal tax rates. Now, we don't have a lot of detail on the patent box yet. It's really just a high-level summary that they gave us. Well, they're going to supposedly apply broader rules that are used in the OECD, but there are a lot of questions still remaining. The government's also said that they may look at clean energy as the next sector to potentially bring into patent box, but at this stage, it's only going to apply to medical and biotech patents that are in Australia. Some key features that are worth considering are that the R&D underpinning that patent must be done in Australia. So you must do your R&D here. So a lot of the businesses and that we deal with obviously are doing the R&D here, but that's a critical part. It does actually raise some questions though. What about those that are doing overseas R&D, even those that have applied for overseas findings as part of their R&D claims? Is that going to impact in any way the patent box eligibility? The patent has to be applied for after the budget announcement, and it must be granted for the reduced tax rate to apply. The patent has to be owned and the income received by an Australian company or at a permanent establishment, so it can't be by any offshore entities or group members. And the income must be derived directly from the patent. And this is the interesting part in the brackets: the income from manufacturing, branding, and other attributes of a patented product or method won't be covered. So there's going to be some interesting rules that we're going to have to look at there around how we differentiate the income derived from manufacturing and branding versus the income derived from the patent in itself, I suppose, on the product. So there's going to be a calculation there to split that out. So there's a lot of questions still remaining, but these are probably the big ones that I'm still uncertain about. As I mentioned before, how much R&D does actually need to be done in Australia for this to apply? If you think about a life sciences company, those doing clinical trials as an example, often phase 3 clinical trials need to be done globally. How is that going to then impact a patent if phase 3 clinical trials are done overseas rather than in Australia? Patents are often granted many years before the technology is actually commercialised. I think when it comes to life science companies, a typical 5 to 10 year period before you actually commercialise a patent is quite common. So that's going to be some time before you can actually start to realise the benefits of the patent box. If you only apply from budget night onwards, then you've got a 5 to 10 year period after that. You've really got 5 to 10 years before you're actually going to be able to apply the rules. So unfortunately, this might not be happening anytime soon. The other thing is, how will the legislation determine what profits are derived directly from the patent, especially where you have multiple patents, some applied for pre-budget night on a particular product, for example. And then how will you split the income and profits from manufacturing, branding, and other attributes that are excluded from the calculation? These are all things that we don't know yet. And finally, just another thing is how will transfer pricing, controlled foreign company rules actually impact the arm's length pricing rules around the profits that are subject to the patent and what can actually include. But broadly, some exciting news, I suppose. So for those in the life science industry that are profitable, you have some great news here that you can get a reduced corporate tax rate in Australia on your patents. Clean energy, keep a lookout. There are some opportunities there for you as well. But really, this is quite a niche program, and hopefully it will open up as the years go by, as the government continues to see the benefit from this. But we'll have to wait for the rules to learn more. But from here, I'll probably hand back to Nikki, who will then take it from here.
Thanks very much, Travis. Now, can people, oh, here we go. I did practice the technology beforehand, and hopefully my screen will come up. Are people able to see my screen?
Perfect.
Awesome. So I'm just going to be talking about the new R&D Tax Incentive Customer Portal. You may or may not be aware that AusIndustry has changed its application process from the smart PDF form that we previously had to this new online portal and a form that's lodged through there. So I'm just going to give you a couple of practical tips to how you actually access that, and also authorise your consultant to access your form on your behalf, and then just run through a couple of quirks with the new form. AusIndustry have said that the rationale for their new to moving to this, obviously technology change, but also a couple of things. They want companies to have more control over what is actually lodged. They feel that in the past that some consultants were lodging applications, R&D applications for customers or companies, and the company wasn't fully aware as to what was actually being lodged. So the part of their rationale to the way that they've set this up is that the company has ultimate control. Secondly, the feedback that they're giving us is that they're not always getting the information that they feel that they need to be able to make a quick assessment as to eligibility of activities, and that a lot of companies are using the opportunity to provide attachments and additional information, and are just giving them a lot of what they would call junk, you know, which is really, I guess, bogging them down in any of their review processes and or quick assessments on eligibility, etc. So that's the idea, I guess, behind some of these changes. Now, these changes come into play for, these changes come into play for applications lodged after 30 June. Now, there is a little bit of a changeover in the system, and you will not be able to lodge an R&D application, regardless of year end, between the 30th of June and the 5th of July. So from the 6th of July, you'll be able to access, or you can currently access the portal, but you can't actually lodge a claim as yet, but you will be able to from the 6th of July. So for those who are all desperate for their cash and like to lodge 1 July, you will have to wait a few more days to be able to lodge your R&D application. For those that are 31 December year end, for example, and actually have until 31 October to lodge your 2020 claim, if you are looking to lodge that after 30 June, you will need to use the new online customer portal and not lodge using the smart PDF form. So if you have started the registration process for the 2020 year and have not yet lodged, you may want to speed that up, because otherwise you are going to have to reformat the way that you are presenting and lodging the information to AusIndustry. Now, in terms of accessing the portal, so it is done through the MyGov system. So you will need MyGov installed and set up on your mobile smartphone. You'd also need access to Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. So even though some people might get confused and see it as part of their tax obligations, it's not the tax portal that you need access to. You actually need access to Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. So if you're not the principal authority for your business, you need to get that principal authority to give you access through the Australian Government's Relationship Authorisation Manager system to access the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. Similar to ATO access, there's two options. You can have full or custom access. There is currently no difference between full and custom for Department of Industry setup. So that's the first thing you need to do. So you then need to go to the website, incentives.business.gov.au, Click login with your MyGov ID. Enter the email address you used when you set up your MyGov ID. And then you'll get an access code, which then you'll be able to get access to the online portal. Don't worry if you don't need to, it's all fairly, I guess, self-explanatory. And we also have an instruction guide that we will be sending out to our clients when we engage, when they do this the first time. We've tested it with a few clients to date, and the feedback is that it is really quite straightforward. So once you get into the customer portal, for the first time, you will come up with this page. And this is basically you just activating as an R&D entity. So you need to click the yes button, and then you'll go into the actual where it has manage your applications. To enable your consultant or other person to be able to access your application as well, you need to go right down to the bottom of that page and press the Manage Access screen button. You'll then be able to add new authorization, and then you can enter your consultant's ABN. So in this case, we've entered Video Services Proprietary Limited, the ABN, and then click the button that they are a tax professional assisting in this process. And then you need to put in the start and end date that consultant will have access to your form. Start date can't be backdated, so it just needs to be the current date or a future date. Maximum end date can be 3 years after. It is our preference, I guess, as a business that you authorise your BDO entity. So for majority of BDO Australia, it's BDO Services. In WA, it's BDO Corporate Tax, or WA Tax. Your consultant will let you know what the correct entity is. You can alternatively authorise individuals to access. Our preference is that you authorise the entity, and the reason being is that if your consultants have changed in team members or left or whatever the case, you'll need to go in and them at a later date and keep that up to date. Whereas if you authorise BDO, then anyone who's authorised by BDO in the R&D network, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, can then have access. So the actual online form, some of the parts of the form haven't changed that much, particularly around the company details. What they have done, though, is moved very much away from project level information to focusing on the core and supporting activities. So they've increased the character count available for core and supporting activities, but decreased at the project level. They've also, there's not an ability to make any attachments whatsoever. So you really need to make sure that you are succinctly explaining in the relevant boxes and answering the questions that AusIndustry wants you to answer within those character limits. I'm going to run through this reasonably quickly, but one of the things just to be noted is that even though they've diminished the character amount from 4,000 characters to 1,000 for your overview or your objectives of your project, one of the things you'll note there that if you can read the small writing, that they've said on the top right of that page where they've said what are the objectives of the project. They said at the project level, the objectives may be described fairly broadly and include both research and development and commercial aims. Please ensure your response allows AusIndustry to understand the purposes for conducting the project. So you might be a little bit flippant about that box, but I think it's really important. AusIndustry are very much on a bandwagon around the purpose for, you need to be conducting your R&D activities for the purpose of generating new knowledge. And throughout the form, they talk about that needs to be a substantive purpose. Now, they have been on this little bit of bandwagon, and they have that's the fact that it needs to be the main substantive purpose has actually been debunked in some recent AAT case, PKWK, etc. But I think just in this box, you may want to make sure that you are explaining that the purpose is to generate new knowledge. With the core activities, as I mentioned, the character have increased. So for the hypothesis, you will need, you've got up to 4,000 characters. You need to explain what was the experiment and how did it test the hypothesis? Again, you've got 4,000 characters. How did you evaluate or plan to evaluate results from your experiment? 4,000 characters. If you've reached conclusions from your experiment in the selected income period, describe those conclusions. One of the changes from the current form as well is that if you've got a future core activity, currently you only need to put the title of that activity and the date that that activity is likely to start. You now, under the new form, if you have a future core activity, will need to describe within that 4,000 characters the intended hypothesis. So you'll need to explain what result you aim to achieve, how and why you think you can achieve it, informed by your background research. So that's a little bit of a change from the current form as well. You then need to, for your core activities, hopefully tick the button, did you conduct this core activity for the substantial purpose of generating new knowledge? I think the answer needs to be yes. And then you're asked in 1,000 characters, what new knowledge was this core activity intended to produce? It should be reiterated that the law actually talks about new knowledge. New knowledge can be new knowledge in itself or can be in the form of new or improved products, processes, services, materials, or devices. So that can be your new knowledge. In the guidelines, AusIndustry talk a lot about needs to be new to the world. You know, there is case law in Wharton Resources, for example, that talks about it can be existing technology being used in a new environment or new application. That can still create new knowledge. So then we need a ticker box where we have to say, how did the company determine that the outcome could not have been known in advance? So, and then you select all that apply. So, for example, there was no applicable information in scientific, technical, or professional literature or patents. Experts in the field provided advice that there wasn't a solution that could be applied. There wasn't a way to adapt solutions from other companies in and out of Australia. The company did not look into existing knowledge. Again, pretty dangerous if you tick that bottom box. And then we've asked, please explain what sources were investigated, what information was found, and why a competent professional could not have known or determined the outcome in advance. And I've just somehow, can you guys still see my slides? I've just somehow lost my screen. There we go. And then the last box there is talking about what evidence did the company, sorry, when I try and open my screen, I cannot, sorry, what evidence did the company keep about the core activity? And again, select all that apply. Interestingly enough, the AusIndustry are quite focused on you having evidence and documentary evidence to support each, I guess, part of the core activity definition. So you, how did you form your hypothesis? What testing, what documents do you have to support your testing? What documents do you have to support that the outcome couldn't have been known, etc. There is a bit of case law again that oral evidence and witness statements, etc., can be persuasive evidence. And under the law, under the provisions and case law, companies are only required to keep ordinary business records to support their R&D. Again, I think it would be dangerous if you did, for example, in this tick box, click other and just then describe the other evidence as ordinary business records. Whilst that may be not impact your eligibility, obviously you are looking to avoid a review if possible. So if you do have other evidence, it may be email exchanges, it may be production records, you know, there may be all sorts of other, which are general business records that do support the eligibility of your activities. One of the positives, I guess, is on supporting activities, that we don't need to repeat the supporting activities to all core activities. We can just put in a supporting activity and link that to the relevant core activities. One of the other, I guess, main changes as well is that currently under the application form under the Smart PDF, you may be aware that Industry asks for estimates of the project expenditure split between the core and supporting expenditure. Whilst you are supposed to update that to Industry if that differs for what you actually lodge in your tax return, estimates are actually fine for that purpose. Again, estimates are still fine under the current form, but the difference is that you are asked for the spend at the activity level. So for each core activity, you will need to say the estimated or actual spend if you know that actual spend, and likewise for the supporting activities. So that was all I was going to cover on the R&D application form and new process. As I mentioned, this will apply for all income years ended 30 June and beyond, 30 June 2021, sorry, lost a year, and beyond, and will also apply for any income years that ended before that date where you don't lodge the application before 30 June. So I'll now hand over to Joel, who's going to give an update to some of the impending changes to the Export Market Development Grant Program.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Today, I just wanted to provide an update in relation to the recent changes that for the EMDG. There's probably the most fundamental changes to the EMDG scheme for a number of years. But to begin with, I guess I want to just provide a bit of update. What is the EMDG? I'm conscious that there's probably some listeners here that may only apply the R&D to their activities, so and may not be aware of the EMDG. So from a high level, up until this point, the EMDG scheme has really been a reimbursement of a company's expenditure for marketing activities. And the marketing activities are generally focused on trying to, I guess, increase your sales, whether it's goods, services, products, IP, for an overseas market. So it's really an underwriting of marketing activities that you may undertake in overseas markets or offshore markets, and in essence, providing a 50% rebate up to a cap for certain eligible expenditure. And it's been Austrade's, I guess, key program to really help small, medium enterprises to undertake export activities and help them, I guess, either enter new markets or develop products and expand their export activities overseas, and really reimburse expenditure really directed at the marketing of those activities. Up until the current regime has always been a reimbursement model, and like I mentioned earlier, it's 50% of that marketing expend up to certain caps in different categories. What occurred last year was that there was the Fisher Review, which was undertaken by the government, and it was basically a roots and branch review of the EMDG scheme, and a review of how can the government, I guess, better support exporters, and a key part of the regime was the EMDG scheme. So within that, some of the I guess key outcomes or findings from the Fisher Review focused on, well, what were the outcomes from businesses, and some of the key criteria or some of the, I guess, negative findings in relation to the current EMDG was, given it was a reimbursement scheme, that there was cases where some of your EMDG expenditure may not be reimbursed for up to 18 months after the spend occurred, and likewise there was always uncertainty into the relation to the amount of reimbursement. Given the scheme, which is the historical and also going forward, is a capped scheme in relation to government funds, there was always this, I guess, final adjustment made to the amount of reimbursement you would receive. So in a fantastic year, you would be entitled to your full 50%. In the, I guess, leaner years, you would be entitled to 50% up to certain caps, maybe 40 grand or so, and then there would be this adjustment, and some reimbursements got as low as sort of 18, 20%. So therefore, I guess from from a business perspective, it wasn't ideal that you may have gone and spent 100K or so on your marketing activities with the hope of reimbursement of 50%, and in some cases may only be receiving sort of 20, 30% of that $100,000. So that was one of the bugbears that came from that. And like I mentioned earlier, the timing of the actual payment, in that if you were, I guess, spending 1st of July in a given financial year, it may not be for almost 18 months or even longer before you received any reimbursement, given the time frame of lodging the claim, and then also the time frame that Austrade required to, I guess, undertake their reviews also. So one of the key changes off the back of that Fisher review was to, I guess, flip the EMDG scheme from a reimbursement model to essentially to a scheme where you will enter a grant program, and you will, in essence, should be able to know in advance how much the payment or reimbursement will be, and the reimbursement will occur throughout the spend life cycle. So it's quite a fundamental change, that it's gone from, I guess, an audited reimbursement scheme to, in essence, you will enter an agreement with Austrade upfront, and then you will have what is defined as more certainty, but we'll wait and see. This is still very fluid at the moment. But what essentially should be a grant that you enter with Austrade, and you should have more certainty in relation to the maximum amount of reimbursement you'll receive, and timing in relation to payments. So just from a high level, a couple of the key changes that are occurring, and probably one of the key ones is that the EMDG up until now, and when I say now, it's up until the end of this year, 30 June 2021, will be the current scheme, but essentially from 1 July 2021, it flips from a $50 million cap for SMEs to a $20 million cap in relation to turnover. So I guess that is a key threshold to be aware of, that if you are, I guess, successful in your export, and your turnover is starting to push up towards that 20 and above, that there is, I guess, risk that you may not be entitled to claim the EMDG in the scheme going forward. The other key change, which I'll talk about a bit more in depth in a little bit, but it's changing the scheme where currently you've always been entitled to 8 years worth of grants. The first 2 years you could have combined historical 2 years into 1 year. There was sort of a max cap of 150K each year for the entire 8-year period. And I guess it was quite simple in relation to that. As long as you had the spend, there were certain caps on different types of eligible expenditure, but you were sort of certain in relation to the amount of spend, the amount of reimbursement, and in relation to from years 3 onwards, that was when I guess you needed to have export earnings to continue the entitlement to the EMDG. What the scheme has done, I guess, in a way to, I would hope, help ensure that you're entitled to your max claims, is that whilst the headline numbers have been reduced, you would hope that, given the pool should stay the same, if not increase in relation to the funds for the entire scheme, you would hope that going forward you would be entitled to the max amount of reimbursement if you fit into any of these tiers. So what the government has produced is essentially a 4-tier structure. The first 3 tiers for the majority of businesses. Tier 4 really focuses just on representative bodies. So if you're a representative body out there representing an industry or a particular sector market, you will fill into this representative body, and that I guess tier is directed at you, I guess, helping that industry or sector, and whether it's training or your own type of advertising, etc., you'll be entitled to 150K over a 3-year period. And essentially with that one from a representative bodies at this point, you can continue to claim that and lodge a new claim every 3 years. I'll emphasise the reason I say it's still fluid at the moment. Final guidelines and things have still not been released in relation to this. There is commentary, there are draft guidelines out, and they are hoped to be finalised by 1 July. So this is still, I guess, fluid in relation to what has been, I guess, bedded down from a legislative requirements and the guidelines. But these are the draft guidelines, which I guess we're all moving forward on and envisage will, I guess, be the bulk of the new changes. Back to the main 3 tiers, which will emphasize for the SMEs. Essentially, the first tier is directed at exporters that are ready to export, or companies that are ready to export but haven't undertaken any export earnings or export activities so far. So that will be eligible for the first 2 years at a cap of 80,000 for 2 years. The second tier, I guess, is what you would consider as the majority of the existing scheme, and that is people that are looking to export and that are undertaking export marketing activities. That tier 2 scheme will be a 3-year scheme at $80,000 per year and capped at 240. And tier 3 is what Austrade is defining as a strategic shift in your activities. And that is, I guess, once you've established a market, you've established some export earnings, you've established your marketing criteria within that sector, you're looking to, I guess, strategically shift, as they've said, to either a change in market, a change in product, etc. And that is probably the bulk of the scheme there, which is 150,000 per year over 3 years, and you'd be entitled to 450 as max. So in essence, if you I guess follow the scheme going forward from 1 July and you follow every year, every tier, etc., the max reimbursement at this point will be 770,000 over that 8-year life cycle. So like the current program, to satisfy the EMDG going forward, you need to first define an eligible product. So from eligible products, as the current one is things as goods, and I guess the emphasis with goods that those aren't aware, they need to be substantially of an Australian origin. Services is an eligible product, and that includes tourism services, so that's something to be mindful of. Events is another one, and events can be held here in Australia as long as the core purpose of that is to promote Australian goods or services. Intellectual property or know-how, which has always been there, moving forward, is still going to be there. And software now is also, which previously either sat between IP or services, depending on the type of software, now has its own category in the new EMDG scheme. So once, I guess, you satisfy the eligible product, then you need to define, well, what is your eligible expenses? So from an eligible expenses perspective, for tier 1 and also the representative bodies one, tier 1, obviously you're just looking at going out to market, so you will obviously have your eligible expenditure in relation to marketing, but you can also include things like training activities. And training activities could include where you may be training marketing representatives or BD type services that you are then going to train those people up and then, I guess, send them out to the market. That type of expenditure now can be included within eligible expenditures. So similar to the previous scheme, so things like maintaining an overseas presence or in a foreign country, short trips to overseas trips, promotional activities like Google, Facebook, websites, IP rights, if you're registering IP rights in certain countries, eligible expenditure, consultants, engaging marketing experts or consultants that may be doing your market research, foreign buyers, they all remain the same in relation to eligible expenses. I guess some of the key changes in relation to this is that previously there were caps on certain categories in relation to, I guess, specifically maintaining an overseas presence or consultants, free samples as an example. Those caps have now been removed. And I guess what is important there is that you could include as the entire expenditure as an example of your claim as maintaining an overseas rep, and there's no longer those caps that apply in relation to that. And I guess from another change in relation to short trips to foreign countries or overseas, there was always the per diem with a max of 21 days being entitled to be claimed. The per diem at the moment has been removed, and you will be entitled to claim expenditures such as accommodation, travel, as in internal taxis, etc., within the scheme. So at the moment, the proposal is to remove the per diem and change that to a reimbursement of expenditure. So like I mentioned, we're moving into this new 4-tier type structure. So tier 1, 40,000, so you will apply for the grant, and it will be $40,000 each year for 2 years. And like I mentioned earlier, it's really directed at those that have an eligible product, have not exported before, and what Austrade is defining have the appropriate skills in marketing eligible products in a foreign country. This can be done, and once we see the final portal uploaded in relation to the application forms, to prove that you have the appropriate marketing skills, there is an Austrade, I guess, webinar/course that you can undertake. It's a very small high-level course that you can tick and partake in. It also says that there's you may also undertake training with a representative body or another provider. There's still, I guess, clarity to come in relation to that. So tier 1 to be eligible, essentially you're looking to export, you have a marketing plan ready to go in relation to what you're looking to do, and you haven't undertaken any export earnings so far. Tier 2 is where, if you have, and I'll touch on this at the end, but if you have previously claimed the EMDG, you're likely to slip into either tier 2 or tier 3, depending where you are on the cycle. But tier 2 is, I guess, that next step up from tier 1, where you've made export earnings, you're undertaking export activities, and really you're having a presence in an overseas market and you're undertaking marketing activities. So that, I guess, grant or that you will enter with Austrade, you can define a 3-year period with $80,000 reimbursement each year with a max grant of $240,000. So when I talk about the $240,000 or the $80,000 per year, obviously per year you'd be needing to maximize that grant of $160K spend in total, or over the life of the 3 years, a maximum spend of $480,000. The final tier is the tier 3, where Austrade's defined as a strategic shift. And this is, I guess, the maximum grant that you'd be entitled to, and that's $150,000 per year over 3 years, which is $450K. So at the moment, Austrade has defined a strategic shift as where you're really looking at targeting either a new market with your existing products, so that may be a new country. So it can be the exact same product, exact same marketing spend, but you're really looking at focusing a new market, or a new country. Or they've also defined as a different market as if it's a large country, say as the US, you may have previously been targeting the East Coast. They define a strategic shift as potentially looking to target the West Coast in relation to that. You may be looking to launch a new product or service that is also categorized as a strategic shift, or you may be looking to, I guess, change the way that your current products are sold, and that may be flipping towards an e-commerce type approach in relation to what you already have from an existing product perspective. Tier 4, like I've already mentioned, is focused really on that representative bodies, and that's $150K over a 3-year period, and that is for those that are really looking to promote the interests of members of their industry sector also. So that's, I guess, a niche one. It is a welcomed addition to the EMDG in relation to the amount of claims that can be picked up for those representative bodies. So a key change, obviously, that we're moving to a prospective model is that previously you really just needed to present within your claim what was your products and what was your expenditure items. Because we're moving to a prospective regime or grant, Austrade want to see what your marketing plan is. So that really didn't have much commentary to begin with, but the new guidelines that have come out back in May have provided a bit more clarity, and I guess it's not as stringent as we all thought it may need to be. They've come out and said, we really want to see, it can be as small as a 1-page statement, and it really just needs to be identifying, well, what is the market you're looking to do? What are your planned activities that you're, from a marketing perspective, looking to spend? how will you measure the success, overall budgets, and the marketing activities that you will undertake. This is what will need to be presented to Austrade when you undertake the initial grant application. So not only will you need to tick off what is your eligible product to begin with, and all the, I guess, the formal requirements in relation to the company, etc., but you will need to present your, I guess, marketing plan. This applies for each of the 3 tiers, all 4 tiers, but essentially tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Obviously the tier 3 difference will be that you need to, I guess, emphasize what your strategic shift will be in relation to that product. So at this point in time, it's anticipated that the new applications will open on the 16th of August and will run for a period from 16th of August to 30 November 2021. So this obviously will capture expenditure from 1 July 2021, and it's something to be mindful of, that if you are already applying for the EMDG and you plan to apply once again for 30 June 2021 under the old scheme, this will run in parallel up until 30 November. So you're really looking at lodging your historical reimbursement type claim, as well as preparing your, I guess, prospective new grant regime. So that will be the time that at the moment that's proposed the applications will open. It's anticipated that Austrade will receive all those applications 30 November, and they will, I guess, review all those and turn them around very quickly, because obviously this is going to be a prospective, so you're going to know exactly how much money you're going to receive straight away. Review all those applications, and yes, that was a bit of sarcasm in there. You will review those applications, and essentially once they understand what the dollar value of people are claiming for, they will then, I guess, work out what the dollar value per grant will be up to the max of that 50%. So it is similar to the current regime, where it will be proportionate based on the number of grants being claimed in relation to the pool of funds. So once that has been done, it may come back with a 48% or a 47%. Like I said, given that the overall dollar values have been reduced per claim, hopefully there will be a larger reimbursement amount. You essentially will enter that a grant agreement with Austrade, and that will essentially outline that the type of marketing activities that you propose to do, the reimbursement amounts, and then it'll also identify what the milestone repayments will be. So that will, I guess, provide further guidance in relation to when you hope to receive your reimbursements. I guess one of the key ones, and I'll just jump back there, is that the commentary so far is that you will not be locked into the type of spend. So Austrade will be willing to accept, if you do vary from what your anticipated plan will be, that there can be amendments made in relation to that. So don't feel, I guess, that you're locked in for that, especially if you're applying for the 3 years first up, that you're locked into that spend over the 3 years. There is room for changing that once you've lodged the application. So like I mentioned, step 2 will be, once the dollar values are assigned to each claimant, you'll enter a grant agreement which will outline what the milestone payments will be over the life of the grant. And like I mentioned, you can apply in writing in relation to amending that. The one thing you will not be able to do is increase the claim. So I guess the strong suggestion would be there to always maximize the amount that you want to claim, because if you, I guess, in essence, go and only claim for 20,000 in that first year, but discover that you want to spend a lot more, you won't be entitled to increase the claim. That's at this point in the guidelines. Who knows, once the final guidelines have been released, that may have the ability to change that. I guess the transition from the old scheme, it's highly, if you've applied for the MDG, you'll probably, like I mentioned earlier, slip straight into either tier 2 or tier 3, depending on where you are. If you have claimed the EMDG before, you won't be, I guess, capped at that 770,000 K for the total scheme, but what you will be capped at will be the 8 years worth of claims. So if you've claimed previously 5 years, there may be a potential that you can slip straight into tier 3 and basically max out those claims for tier 3 going on going forward, and then that brings you to the end of your eight years. There's traditional, I guess, approach. If this is your first year and you haven't had export earnings, you go into tier 1, and I guess you could progress your way through that. But I guess that's the key, that if you have already claimed the EMDG, and that you may have only claimed it, sorry, you may have claimed it 10 years ago or so, whatever you've previously claimed, that will count towards your number of years in relation to the new scheme. Like I mentioned, the current guidelines are still in draft, so there may be additional changes, and with the aim of releasing the final guidelines on 1 July 2021. In relation to current year, and that's spend happening now up until 30 June this year, FY21, the process is exactly the same. So you need to, from 1 July up until 30 November this year, apply for your FY21 as per normal. There's been no changes in relation to the current year. And it may be something, if you're thinking about being a first year claimant in relation to having the ability to go back 2 years, it may be something from a strategic planning that you may want to think about, whether you want to put in an application this year, because you may find the benefit that outweighs the delaying of that to pick up the new scheme going forward. I guess that's it from the EMDG side. Like I said, that scheme commences from 1 July 2021. I think we have a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions they want to shoot through, but likewise, each of us are happy to respond afterwards via email, or even if you want to send a message through now, we can respond via email later or give you a call if you prefer that. So we have a couple of minutes now if anyone has any questions.
So Joel, we have actually had a couple of questions come through, and one is on the EMDG, which I think you've answered, but just to clarify, what's been asked is, if you had an EMDG claim in FY20 or FY19, is this a restart and you can get 2 years at tier 1 again?
No, unfortunately not. So the guidelines at the moment is essentially, if you've already claimed the EMDG, you would slip highly likely into tier 2 going onwards. I guess the key one to emphasise in relation to C1, the way the guidelines are drafted now, it says that you have not previously made export sales. So I'm not sure if Austrade seem to be quite fluid in their interpretations of this, but my fear with that is that you may have lodged on your BAS an export sale of a small amount a year or two ago, and does that block you from starting off at tier 1, tier 2? At tier 1. So I guess there is a risk there in relation to, is there a threshold in relation to GST, in relation to export sales? But tier 1 is really designed for brand new people entering the scheme that have not undertaken export sales previously.
Thanks very much for that, Joel. We've just got probably time for one final question that's come through that I might throw to Travis. It's if an expense has been considered for R&D tax offset, can it also be considered for EMDG?
Broadly, the schemes are actually quite different. So the R&D is obviously trying to fund your research and development activities, and EMDG is really trying to fund your marketing activities, which typically would fall outside of R&D anyway, because it would be really focused on your marketing activities. There, I suppose there probably is the odd occasion where you might attend an industry conference where you might have a dual purpose of, looking at both export activities and export sales as well as R&D. But typically there would be no crossover, and hence, yes, you shouldn't be able to claim between R&D. If you've got it in R&D, there's no reason it should be in EMDG and vice versa. So, that's.
I think maybe patenting is one area where we have seen a bit of an overlap, but I guess in that, under the current provisions, as Travis went through before, there is a change in regard to clawback on grants. So currently that would be considered a government recruitment, the EMDG, and so that if you then wanted to claim that the same expenditure in R&D, you would need to undertake that clawback calculation. If you are under 20 million turnover, which you would be if you're getting EMDG going forward, then there is still a net benefit potentially if that expenditure did qualify for both schemes up until 30 June 2021, but going forward, as Trav said, there is a change in the clawback provisions, which means there'll be no net benefit to be able to, basically you won't be able to double dip on claiming both R&D and EMDG, for example. So we are now full to time. I will say thank you very much to everyone. There was a lot of information that we covered in a sort of fairly short period of time. As Joel mentioned, we're very willing to take any questions from anybody if you want to shoot those through. Our contact details for each of the officers, Melissa in Adelaide, Trav in Melbourne, Graham and Nick in Sydney, myself in Brisbane, and Natalie in Perth, or anybody else that you deal with within the BDO network can direct you in the right direction. So thank you very much, everyone, for this morning's attending this morning's webinar. Thank you.